It's such a pleasure to have back on Bad Faith. Once again, someone that I describe full-heartedly as a genuine American hero, former presidential candidate for the Green Party, consumer advocate, Ralph Nader. Thanks for returning. There's so much for us to talk about. So much has happened since you were last on the podcast. And I really want to highlight the work you've been doing with the Capitol Hill Citizen, a publication that we, of course, have mentioned on the podcast before, but I do want to draw people's attention to because it really does, I think, cover in a very sharp and important way the issues that the left should be principally concerned about instead of just always kind of reflexively and reactively talking about what the mainstream media is getting wrong. So thank you for that as well. I want to start by asking you, given your kind of fame or in some groups infamy as a Green Party candidate, what you make of the kind of status of third-party movements here today. As many listeners know, I've been sort of wringing my hands over how quickly a lot of the left has gotten so-called coconut-pilled and enthusiastic once again about the Kamala Harris campaign. As we speak today on Friday, we are anticipating Jill Stein making a vice presidential announcement that may or may not generate more interest in the Green Party candidacy. But I just want to get your take on what's going on in terms of alternate party politics right now in this moment.
Well, it's the same old assault on the ballot access rights of third party and independent candidates. There's no country in the Western world that makes it so difficult for people who are not part of the two-party duopoly to run for office, just to get on the ballot, to give voters more voices and choices, which is what a competitive democracy is supposed to be all about. So as we speak, the Democratic Party is suing the Green Party in Wisconsin, which is already qualified and is on the ballot, to get them off the ballot. And it's the same thing that happened to us. We would have 20, 25 lawsuits by the Democratic Party or its proxies to get us off one state ballot after another. So this is political bigotry. The Democratic Party talks about the Republicans suppressing voters. Well, they do a great job in suppressing candidates, and the two go together, don't they? So the main problem is the Democratic Party, instead of trying to get more votes from the 80 million people who are expected not to vote in November's presidential election, they're going after the minuscule votes of the Green Party instead of doing what Harry Truman did years ago, and he confronted Henry Wallace's Progressive Party in 1948. He took away Wallace's domestic issues. No, so why don't the Democrats, instead of scapegoating, every time they lose to the Republicans, they scapegoat the Greens. They never look at themselves in the mirror. They never introspect because they're controlled by these corporate conflicted political media consulting firms who, serve corporations throughout the year. And then during the election time, they're hired with big fees by the Democratic Party to put these insipid TV ads on instead of the ground game, because these consultant firms, Briahna, get 15% of the TV buy. So they're not interested in a ground game, which is really what gets voters out with mandates and agendas. So that's the problem.
It is interesting. There is a sort of kind of rhetorical pivot that you see a lot online, so much, frankly, that sometimes I wonder if it is a kind of bought astroturfy kind of situation where people will say about the Greens, well, you only pop up every 4 years. You don't care about local elections, prove your merit, prove your mettle locally before you expect me to care about your national political ambitions. And we've responded to that on the podcast before. But one counter argument that comes to me as you're describing the uphill battle that Greens are facing just to stay on the ballot is that they are entangled in all of the legal pushback by the Democratic Party. And you could very easily turn it around and say, well, if you want the Green Party to have more wealth and resources to do more in various states and local elections, then why don't you encourage the Democratic Party to stop having such an adversarial relationship to the Greens so that they can focus elsewhere? I mean, how can you say you're going to give your vote to a Democratic Party that has shown complete disdain, antagonism toward Green Party efforts, as they have also shown complete and utter disdain for progressives within their own party? thinking most recently, obviously, about Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman being pushed out for I, ostensibly supporting Palestine in any way. And say that the problem here is that the Green Party isn't using its resources in X, Y, and Z way. Yeah.
Instant runoff voting. Why don't they
Yeah.
push for instant runoff voting?
Yeah.
But no, they have to have a scapegoat.
They have to have vote blue no matter who, or everything crumbles. Yeah.
Yeah, the press follows the scapegoat. So it's like a hound dog. You know, instead of the press focusing on the decrepitude of the corporate Democratic Party, how they've written off half the nation, red state, blue state, etc., and how they dial for the same corporate dollars as the Republicans. No, they go after the Greens to say, why are you being a spoiler? Well, the Greens are trying to deal with a spoiled political system.
Yeah. I mean, to that end, there is a piece in the most recent edition of Capitol Hill Citizen that specifically talks about the relationship between AIPAC and the Congressional Black Caucus. It's been very interesting to watch another one of these sort of media narratives that's playing out right now is this, again, sort of astroturf feeling argument that to support Gaza, to support Palestine is somehow anti-Black, that there is an ask of Black Americans to prioritize the interests of Palestinians before their own, and therefore, Black people are being asked not to vote for Kamala Harris. That's supposed to have all this representational value for Black Americans, and that should be a priority, and that is a moral and just priority over stopping an ongoing genocide. The idea that these two things are mutually exclusive and that they shouldn't be pressuring Kamala Harris to stop the genocide and get Black votes, all of that has been going on online as well. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit about this relationship between AIPAC and the Congressional Black Caucus and what is going on here, how historically that relationship has been weaponized to play on both white guilt and perhaps some feelings of Black voters that there's a zero-sum game in their voting.
There's no zero-sum game. Exploitation doesn't recognize these kinds of barriers and red lines. They all bleed the same color in different ways. Minorities in the U.S., people in the third world, Palestinians. For a little over $11 million, as the Capitol Citizen points out, the AIPAC PACs have stilled the voice of the Black Congressional Caucus. Really quite amazing. And the Capitol Citizen has the pictures of the 39 members of the Black Caucus, there are 60 of them, and how much they've taken over their careers. And for a little more than $11 million, Briahna, AIPAC has silenced the Congressional Black Caucus on the genocide in Palestine. Yeah. That's quite an efficient investment, considering that AIPAC spent more than $11 million to defeat Jamal Bowman in a primary in New York State a few weeks ago. And so why isn't this story in the mainstream press? That's why the Congressional Black Caucus, that's why the Capitol Citizen is so important, because it covers for people stories that are never told in the mainstream press. And they're all in plain sight. Stories like what can be done to get congressional committees working for their pay. There's 10 congressional hearings that must be pushed by the people of this country, because that's an entry level into the Congress for the people. They haven't had a hearing on big money in politics. Imagine that. They haven't had a hearing on updating the corporate crime laws. They haven't had a congressional hearing on why the tax system is reducing taxation on the super rich and the corporations. The former chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, the crypto Republican by the name of Richard Neal, he's a congressman from Western Massachusetts. The first thing he did in January 2019, when he took over the helm of the House Ways and Means Committee, is say he wasn't going to revisit the Trump tax cuts. What? Trillions of dollars is sick. He's not going to read it. So he blocked the subcommittees from having hearings on it. So there are corporate welfare hearings. Why are taxpayers paying hundreds of billions of dollars a year for handouts, giveaways, subsidies, bailouts for giant corporations that are making tons of money and are under tax. No hearing on that. There's no hearing on getting rid of the anti-worker union laws. We have the worst anti-union laws in the Western world, led by the notorious Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. And there's never been a hearing on that. Now, why is this important article in the Capitol Citizen? Because you can go to your senators and representatives and say, look, we're not asking you to pass a certain bill. We're asking you to give these civic voices a chance to testify at the Senate and the House. And when these hearings occur, they're usually likely to be covered by the mainstream press because, you know, they're inside Congress, a pretty powerful institution. So this just goes on and on. We've called for people to understand that there's a new group in Congress of staff. There's an interview of Jacob Wilson, who started the Congressional Progressive Staff Association. They have 1,900 members now in the House and Senate, and they're speaking out on Gaza. They're speaking out by taking their conscience to work. They're not just, obeying their principles. This is a very courageous development. Now, when you have 1,900 staff like that who believe in independent speaking by the staff, that's a lot of entry points for people around the country. They don't have to just deal with the senators and representatives. So the Capitol Citizen is designed to make people more powerful Capitol Hill citizens themselves. And that's why it's important for them to get a copy. It's print only because we want a serious audience. And they can go to CapitolCitizen.com, and for a donation of $5 or more, they can get a copy sent to them, 40 pages, first class, right away by return mail. And if they want more for their circle of friends, workers, neighbors, family who are interested in reasserting people's control over democracy that's deteriorating by the week, they can get extra copies and get the instructions for on CapitolHillCitizen.com. It's beautifully designed too, Briahna. I think you'll agree. It's very clear to read and beautifully designed.
I think that's all right. And frankly, I find it, even looking at it in PDF form, it is refreshing to read something that is well laid out and that doesn't have flashing ads on the sides of the margins. And it does feel like a more engrossing and serious read. I'm one that's prone to. I have an article here that I've printed out that I wanted to read from Branko Marcetic. I regularly print things out because I'm too distractible and a little ADHD, and otherwise can't always consume things the way that I'd really like. So I do strongly recommend it. I want to come back to a point that you made a little bit earlier about Richie Neal and the inability to get basic hearings on American priorities. I'm reminded when you brought up Richard Neal that his name was being bandied about in the context of the forced vote conversation a couple of years ago, precisely because he was someone who said that the words Medicare for all shouldn't be used in the ostensible Medicare for all hearing that they had back in like 2018, I think it was. That it wasn't a real Medicare for all hearing. And some people who disagreed with the asks of a floor vote on Medicare for all thought that additional or at least supplementary asks could be, or alternate or supplementary asks could be getting someone like Richie Neal off of the Ways and Means Committee, where he is in a position to stymie progress on Medicare for all. And I just do think it's a useful reminder that there have been these sort of inflection points, leverage points in the recent past where we could have been making what is frankly reformist and incremental progress, but progress nonetheless on some of these key ticket issues. I want to ask how you're feeling right now about the Democratic Party, the Kamala Harris campaign, and the resurgence of interest in her now that she has become the presumptive nominee, and how you're feeling about how the ways that that's affected left energy, particularly around the issue of Gaza.
Well, we're seeing slightly different rhetoric by Kamala Harris. Shows a little compassion for the slaughter of the Palestinian people. But by and large, everything she says is what Biden said in his feeble attempt to turn Netanyahu around. And some of us don't even think it's an attempt. He does whatever Netanyahu wants, and so does the State Department and the Pentagon and the Congress, which gave Netanyahu, a war criminal, mass murderer, 52 standing ovations. Even George W. Bush, after he was slaughtering people in Iraq with his criminal war of aggression, he only got 37 standing ovations from the Democrats in his State of the Union speech. But here's the litmus paper test. There's a massive undercount of the fatalities in Gaza. That's one of the lead articles. I wrote it in the Capitol Citizen. They're taking a Hamas count of 40,000 or so, when the real count is over 300,000 dead Palestinians, and that will double by the end of the year easily. Why is this occurring? Well, Hamas doesn't want to have the full count because they don't want to be criticized by their own people for not protecting themselves and providing shelters. Netanyahu, of course, wants a low count as he slaughters and genocides babies, children, families, women, mothers, fathers, refugee camps, apartment buildings, homes, water mains, electric networks, churches, mosques, you name it, hospitals, health clinics. He doesn't want the real count. And of course, the State Department, which has a much better estimates, has been shut up. The Assistant Secretary of State in November, testifying for Congress, blurted out that the death toll was greater, even much greater, than what Hamas was releasing. And that was the last time anybody in the Biden administration mentioned the vast undercount. Now, why is it important? Other than just the moral issue, they're slaughtering Palestinians while they're alive, and then they don't count them while they died. One undertaker and his crew in February said that he has buried in mass graves 17,000 Palestinians, 800 in one day. You have over 100,000 precision bombs dropping on an area double the size of the District of Columbia, with 2.3 million people crowded together, destroying anything that moves and anything that stands. And we're led to believe that over 98% of Palestinians, as of now, have survived. Over 100,000 bombs, hundreds of artillery shells, thousands of them, snipers, disease, lack of medical care, contaminated water, starvation, constant homelessness, moving thousands under Israeli orders, torture, kidnapping, 5,000 babies born every month into the rubble. They have no food. They have no health care. The hospitals have been destroyed. Now, anybody who thinks, Briahna, that the Israeli army does not consciously target civilians ought to go through history. That's what they've done from day one. You can cite, for example, in Capitol Citizen, the formidable ambassador to the UN for Israel and scholar and minister, Abba Eban, in the early 80s, basically said, of course, Israelis have been targeting civilians since day one. And he was chiding a fellow politician who was trying to promote the usual propaganda that they don't target civilians. That's what's done. They did it in 2009 with massive bombing in Gaza, 2014. They've done it in the West Bank, etc. So that's why this newspaper is so critical, because it empowers people. You should see the response to it, the letters to the editor. It's like a fresh breeze coming out of the stench of Capitol Hill, which we call Withering Heights, corporate occupied territory. 535 members who are using the delegated power of the sacred we the people to the preamble of the United States and turning it over to 1,500 or so corporations and other special interest groups. For example, there's never been a hearing for the Israeli and Palestinian peace advocates who are in touch with each other for decades, since 1948, since the establishment of the State of Israel. The Congress has obeyed AIPAC and never allowed these former generals, former mayors, ministers, leading intellectuals. These are prominent people, and they never allow them to have a hearing in the Senate and the House. The Congress, as the Capitol Citizen points out, they only work about 130 days a year, and when they're in Washington, it's just Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So no wonder they can't have more time for congressional hearings, and yet we pay them full time, and they want a pay raise. By the way, Briahna, but here they're afraid of the people, and they've scotched the pay raise, as indicated in an article in the Capitol Citizen. So when they know the people know what they're up to, and when they know the people are going to grab them back home and call them out on it, or they're going to phone them, or they're going to write them, they put their finger to the wind and they pull back. But what we need are more people on more issues to deal with the empire, the corporate supremacy, the destruction of our democracy.
I look at your article and I look at the $11 million figure for spending on the Congressional Black Caucus. And honestly, it feels like such a depressingly small sum of money to have captured a population, a group of people who historically have been framed as the conscience of Congress and who do have some rhetorical capacity to be injurious to the success of the Democratic Party and to mobilize Black voters without whom the Democratic Party could never win an election. And I do wonder if you look at that and you look at the last 10 months in Gaza and you look at how sort of quickly the movement to resist Israel has been sort of deflated by the changing of the guard at the top of the Democratic Party ticket. And if you feel, I don't know, ever overwhelmed or demoralized by the one step forward, two steps back of it all. I mean, are you still looking at this election cycle, or have you ever looked at this election cycle as I had, as a sort of opportunity for the left to sharpen the contradictions now that I think the Democratic Party has effectively muddled the contradictions by swapping in a candidate about whom we know very little and who has to date said very little specifically about how she is going to depart from Biden from a policy perspective?
Well, first of all, Biden's still president. She doesn't have the power of the presidency. So
Sure.
You have to unravel her rhetoric and ask her, you've shown compassion, and you said you will not be silent on the death and destruction of civilian life in Gaza. Okay, what is the real count? Why don't you get the State Department? You get your calls returned from Anthony Blinken. It gets the State Department to come out with the real estimates. It makes a big difference. If it's 300,000 instead of 40,000, it changes the dialogue. It changes the attitude of the press. It intensifies civic action. It intensifies even diplomatic action.
I think the problem in large part, though, is that she's not doing any interviews at all. And there are articles being written about how wise it is for her, frankly, to not do interviews because she has kind of nowhere to go but down. And I think from a sort of comms perspective, that's right. From a substantive justice perspective, I think it's a problem. And it's a problem, I think, for the left right now, if I'm going to be really honest, that there are things that are more appealing and comforting and tonally different about her that makes, I think, a lot of folks want to believe there's going to be something different. And she's kind of in this sweet spot where, because she's only vice president, she can be seen as not really responsible for Biden's agenda, while she gets credit for having kind of leadership ability by virtue of her having been in that position. There's an expectation that, if she can't outwardly contradict Biden the way you would expect a different kind of candidate to contradict the person that they're ostensibly running against, right? Because she's in the administration. So she gets to have it both ways. Well, of course she can't say Biden's wrong, she's still a part of his administration, but trust me, she's going to be better when she's president. I mean, that's kind of where she sits. And I don't really know how you argue. It's very difficult to argue against that without seeming like me, is a bad faith actor that's not, quote unquote, willing to give her the benefit of the doubt.
Well, she's not going to be able to escape the reporters for very long. They sort of give her a honeymoon. She made the circular trip with her vice president choice, Walz, and she will not be able to do that. The Democratic convention is coming up in a few days. The press is going to be all over it. She's going to have to start being more specific. It isn't just what's going on in Gaza and Palestine. It isn't just what is going on in Ukraine and Russia. It isn't just what the American empire is doing to the world. It's what the empire is doing to us here in terms of our priorities, our disinvestment in public works, our not providing universal health care, a living wage, and even free speech is being affected by the Gaza situation. The Israeli lobby that says the Israeli government can do no wrong is suppressing free speech in this country. It's getting people fired. It's getting events canceled on universities. It's distorting Congress into a grotesque tale of the Netanyahu genocidal dog. And so it tends to interest more people when you see what the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is doing to our own country, to our priorities, to our freedoms, to our recognition of the humanity of people who are being destroyed by massive weapons shipped daily over there and elsewhere, for that matter, around the world. So she's not going to be able to escape that. And her vice president is going to be more outspoken. He's got to be careful, too. They all have to be careful of the Israeli lobby, obviously. But there are ways to unravel it. And the vast undercount is great because you have all these UN humanitarian groups. You have the Global Food Program, the Central Kitchen Program, the Doctors Without Borders. They know there's a massive undercount, but they're waiting for Washington to step forward on this. They're waiting for the press to make a big issue on this. Just think what would happen if when the senators and representatives go back, they're on August recess. They took 5 weeks off. What if people said, look, we want to make a big deal out of Labor Day. No more just sales and going to clam banks and smiling for you candidates. We want to turn Labor Day into an agenda day with a compact for American workers, all workers, regardless of the political labels, living wage, health insurance, union rights, etc. That's possible. Now, I've talked to the top union chiefs, starting with Liz Schuler of the AFL-CIO, and they all like the idea of a revitalized, agenda-driven Labor Day with hundreds of events locally all over the country, connecting with the candidates, command performance. You have to show up, connecting with citizen groups that would love to participate. But they're not getting the go-ahead from the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is like schizophrenic. They want to win elections, but only on Wall Street's terms, only on empire's terms, only on corporate welfare kings' terms. And we got to say that's not acceptable. And that's why when people say, who should people vote for? I say, you vote for your conscience. You don't vote for somebody who's going to turn against you or someone who's killing your relatives in Palestine or your friends' relatives in Palestine, or is pushing empire to a wider war, whether in the Middle East or Eastern Europe, and now they're provoking East Asia. You vote your conscience. Now, the best agendas are the agendas of Green Party Jill Stein and Cornel West, who's going to be probably on too few ballots to make a difference. But how can anybody vote for people who are going to turn on them and who have turned on their interests just because it's either the Republican and Democrat two-party duopoly. Like they own the votes in America. They don't have to earn them. People have got to get over this idea, Briahna, of wanting to vote for a winner. I had a lot of people when I was running, Ralph, we love what you're doing. We love what you've done over the decades. But, third party, Green Party, independent, you're not going to come close to winning. So we have to vote for a winner. So they vote for a winner who then loses their democracy for them in return for some campaign cash. So we have to address the voter here. We can't just, assume that the voters are generically fine and pure and victims. We've got to get them to do their homework. I mean, look how many of them are buying the Trump trite. All the nonsense, the lies, the fantasies, the broken promises, the delusions, the smears, the defamation. They would never associate with a neighbor or someone on the job with somebody like Trump. They have to be talked to. Why are you doing this? He's going to have a lot of power if you put him in office over you, not just the world. So we've got to break through. The mainstream media on Kamala Harris, it's all personal stuff. Look at all the articles, all the personal stuff, right down to what she wears and what's her laugh like. And they're starting to do the same thing with Jay Walls. What kind of a football coach was he? Well, he has an agenda. And if he doesn't have the right agenda, and if Harris doesn't have the right agenda, the people push the agenda. But they got to have the kind of materials that the Capitol Citizen provides. It's a powerful instrument. Again, you can get a copy by going to capitolcitizen.net for a donation of $5 or more. If you want more, there are instructions. Spread the word. There are people getting extra copies for coffee shops, for high school libraries, public libraries, neighbors. When you get information like this, it motivates you. It empowers you. It improves your judgment. And you don't go through life saying that you're a nobody. You don't count. You don't matter because you're a nobody. The one thing I couldn't stand with voters when I was campaigning is that they'd come up to me and they'd say, well, Ralph, I'm a nobody, but I got a question. I said, don't you ever call yourself a nobody. You're an everybody.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate that. Frankly, as someone who feels admittedly a little demoralized right now, not because, I mean, I feel like I was more optimistic when I believed that more problems could be solved by addressing the sort of media blackout information gap aspect that you're alluding to, in which a paper like the Capital Citizen helps to solve, right? That's part of why I have a podcast. That's part of why I wanted to go and work in comms for the Bernie administration. It was, or for the Bernie campaign. It felt like, yeah, there's an information gap. There's media blackout. People are being, brainwashed by their educational systems, and we can kind of break through. We can help to break through. But then sometimes when I'm having, it was been a tough news week and I'm having a little bit of a low mood sort of a day, I think I've learned enough to know, like the more that I learned, the more entrenched the problems appear to be and the more impossible change feels. And I
So
think
let me turn this around.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me turn this around. Look at American history. Almost every advance in justice in American history, except maybe the GI Bill of Rights during World War II, started with a few conversations between people. Then there were more conversations. Then there were marches. Then there were demonstrations. Then that demonstration of power started getting the ear of reporters. And then the politicians started putting their finger to the wind. And then they started adopting some of these in state legislatures or city councils or Congress. Now, that's the way it happened. The Liberty Party was a tiny party in 1840, and its main agenda was get rid of slavery. So everybody laughed. Well, they weren't laughing after a few years. The Women's Suffrage Party started with a handful of women with signs. Everybody laughed. Well, they weren't laughing after a few years. The labor farmer movements started with people who had no power, no contacts, no money, but they had energy, they had moral authority, they had organizing, and they got a lot of things through, regulating the banks and the railroads in the old days, and giving people the right to form unions, which was not even legal until almost 100 years ago under the corporate-dominated legal system. Now, in our case, fast forward, we had less than 1,000 people around the country to get the auto industry regulated. Yeah. And here's the key. It has taken less than 1% of active citizens to achieve all these things, including the environment, including the civil rights movement. Less than 1%, that's 2.5 million people, adults, in congressional districts. Now, there are three requisites to make that work. The people who are pushing for justice, they got to know what they're talking about. They got to know the details. They got to be accurate. They got to be articulate. The second is they represent public opinion, majority public opinion, or growing public opinion. And the third, they don't just march and demonstrate and send the energy into the ether. They focus laser-like on the senators and representatives. The two most powerful civic lobbies in America, they don't have any demonstrations or marches, the NRA and AIPAC. They just focus on the senators and representatives and their staff and who's their friends back home golfing, who their lawyers are, who their doctors are. It's called in personam lobbying, something that civic movements are not learning enough about. Remember, there's only 535 of them in Congress, and we usually have 20, 30% of them on our side on most issues to begin with. So this less than 1%, with the Occupy Wall Street, they always talked about the other 1% that dominates. Well, we should talk about what we need, and that gives people real motivation. It doesn't depress them like they need 50% or 60%. The vanguard is always what prevails as long as they reflect the mass opinion. And there's a lot of left-right support for all kinds of improvements in this country, including de-bloating the military budget, including universal health care, including breaking up the big banks, including universal health care, including cracking down on corporate crooks, including completely reforming the tax system that exempts so many profitable corporations and billionaires from the most minimal taxation, including reforming Congress, including getting money out of politics. All of these things can be achieved with organization by 1% or less of the people. They can have it as their hobby, a Congress watchdog hobby. Just like people, have other hobbies. That it involves spending a little money, volunteer time, and opening up offices in each congressional district. I mean, I'm not just pontificating here like a Harvard political science professor or something. We've actually achieved it in the past. And things got worse. When you were growing up, things got worse. The corporations counterattacked. They established more PACs. They neutralized more workers. They shipped more jobs abroad, weakening the labor movement. So now it's time for one of these cyclical counterattacks. And we're trying to put in people's hands the Capitol citizen. But there's a lot of information that's available on the internet. You don't have to rely on the mainstream press. Russell Mokhiber, the editor of Capital Citizen, points this out all the time. We have far more information about injustice and what can be done to correct it and what people are doing around the country that we can learn from and collaborate with already free on the internet. No excuses.
Can I ask you to change this just slightly, but something I really specifically want to ask you about as opposed to any other guests. Given how long you've been working and as you just alluded to, successfully to influence elected officials. And as savvy and knowledgeable as you are about the ways in which they insulate themselves and push back and fight back, were you surprised that Biden ultimately was ousted by what seems to be Nancy Pelosi in a way that has reportedly damaged the relationship between the two of them, as has been written up in Politico and some other sources, that he was very much pushed out by a kind of internal coup led by Nancy Pelosi. Were you surprised to see that happen?
He was pushed out by mass demonstrations and the loss of a few percentage points vis-a-vis Trump, putting him behind in the swing states. Nancy Pelosi, with her finger to the wind, said, time is up. We got a winner-take-all electoral college system, where the Democrats can win the national vote and lose the presidential race, as they did in 2000 and 2016 with Trump, even though they won the national popular vote. And so she basically said, hey, this is only getting worse. Everywhere Biden goes, he's being challenged on the Palestinian genocide issue. He's being challenged on other issues everywhere he goes. And she realized that the slippage was not stopping. And, Biden can lose on the margins. He can win the national popular vote and lose Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia. And that's what led her to act. Don't think she started it all. It started with hundreds of thousands of young people.
It certainly does seem to be the case that the Democrats have had historically unpopular candidates in the past, where polls might not have shown them doing quite as badly as Joe Biden was, but pretty badly, pretty neck and neck. And I'd say that was true in 2016 and it was true in 2020. And it hasn't caused the Democratic Party to put their finger on the scale in favor of a more populist candidate. It does seem like they have time and time again said, I would rather lose than let someone like Bernie win, or I would rather lose than even let someone who, like Elizabeth, you know what I mean? Like, not that she was really in contention, but people who are, to the left of Joe Biden were not the ones that were chosen to defeat Bernie in 2020, even though Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar both were more successful electorally than Joe Biden up until South Carolina. So to me, it still does seem surprising. I mean, at the end of the day, I still am sort of kind of curious about the decision tree that happened there. Do you think it was his age seemed like there was no saving him from his the kind of like cognitive decline seemed to be something that they just could not turn around and they couldn't deny, unlike denying that, Hillary Clinton could pull one out over Trump, for instance?
Well, there's a powerful clique that dominates the Democratic Party. It's called the corporate Democrats, like Richard Neal from Western Massachusetts. They are in turn controlled willingly by the corporate conflicted political media consultants who run their campaigns, who decide who gets access to the senator or the representative or the challenger. The press has missed a big story on this. The corporate consultants operate in the shadows, but they're everywhere. They actually write the press releases. They decide what calls get through, and they are on the side of a corporate political system, number one. Number two, there are certain lobbies that over time have a hammerlock on the Democrats, regardless of whether they're going to lose votes for the Democrats. Of course, we know the NRA, we know AIPAC, but there are other lobbies, long relationships, junkets, golfing out, the plane, very long relationships. Their children working in these areas. I mean, Schumer has 2 children working for Silicon Valley companies, for example. And so these are all in the shadows. So what you're pointing out is quite correct. They want to win elections, but only on their terms, not on the terms of the public interest. And they're very stubborn. And the way they overthrew Bernie Sanders is a perfect a bit of evidence as to what I'm saying. He was on his way, and they ganged up on him in South Carolina, and suddenly he was on the sidelines, and Joe Biden emerges. And they did the same thing in 2016 in Nevada. Hillary Clinton messed around with the counting through her hench people, and there are people in Nevada said that Bernie won that and broke his momentum. So Bernie has a great interview that he could give you, doesn't
he? That he could give me?
Yeah, I'm saying this only half humorously.
Yeah, he. I don't think he'll be sitting down with me ever again. He's
someday he'll write the book on how he was sabotaged in 2 presidential elections when he started with 0 public opinion and broke the practice of only raising money from fat cats and could have taken the presidency.
He's been talking about it recently. He did an interview with sort of a comedian, I guess, called Theo Vaughn, where he said pretty explicitly, yeah, I think Theo was the one who brought it up, but that the elections were rigged, and that the Democratic Party, was out to get him. And he's been talking pretty openly about that stuff recently. I'm not sure why.
I ran in 2016. I ran against Hillary Clinton, and I ran in 2020.
Yeah, I remember, and I felt like you didn't get treated fairly, to be honest with you.
Well, I didn't, and that's what happens when you take on the establishment. So what happened is we won the first 3 primaries, and then the establishment got very, very nervous, and there were a whole lot of candidates in the Democratic primary, and they said, hey, it'd be a good idea if you all dropped out, let Joe Biden be the one candidate. People rallied around him.
And do they call? Is there a call that you get, and it's like you're not going to move forward? Is it just like news articles? Like how does the establishment
what happens
work?
Is I won the popular vote in Iowa, I won the New Hampshire primary, I won the Nevada primary, and those were the first 3. And then front pages of the New York Times, Democratic establishment very nervous, Bernie Sanders could win the whole. We were doing very well in the polls, and I think behind the scenes, people thought there were like 15 different candidates. And they were splitting up the vote, and that's how I was not necessarily getting over 50%. I was getting more than other people, so I was on the way to victory. And they said, look, Bernie shouldn't be the candidate for a variety of reasons. We don't want him the candidate, drop out. And then on one day, a lot of people, 1 or 2 days, a lot of people dropped out. It was Joe Biden and me, and Joe had a lot of support, and all these people came behind him.
And do you think that our election process is still democratic? Do you think it's still?
Yes and no. I mean, you want to run for office. Can you? Yeah, you can. You got a certain number of signatures. But if you're going to win, and I have 10 times more money than you do, I will beat you 95% of the time.
Wow.
I mean, that's a fact, right?
Right, 100%.
You'll beat me. Maybe if you're really an exceptional candidate and I'm a real idiot, you will beat me once in a while. But by and large, the money people will win. So if you're asking me, are we a democracy? In one sense, we are. All right, you can run for office. You can raise your issues. On the other hand, in terms of who has the real power, money people do. And I use the term oligarchy. An oligarchy is a society where small numbers of very wealthy people control the economic and political life of the country. I think we are moving rapidly in that direction.
Yeah, I feel like to me, it feels like almost privatized communism in a way.
Right. That's a very good point. It's an interesting way of looking at it.
It's a little, I don't know, everything, all of this, the timing of this, the kind of shifts that have happened, and it all feels very weird. I mean, you allude to, the corporate Democrats saying that they're willing to win, but only on their own terms. I mean, that does bring me back to the Kamala question. So this morning she releases an economic agenda, which is good. Superficially, at least, the Washington Post describes it in a headline: Kamala Harris unveils populist policy agenda with $6,000 credit for newborns. The vice president endorses government action on housing, groceries, medical debt, drugs, and other issues. I'll read just a little bit of this. The most striking proposals were for the elimination of medical debt for millions of Americans, the first ever ban on price gouging for groceries and food, a cap on prescription drug costs, a $25,000 subsidy for first-time home buyers, and a child tax credit that would provide $6,000 per child to family for the first year of a baby's life. Now, I'm tired of having to be the cynical, negative Nancy all the time, but I do have to ask myself, is this in good faith? Is this wonderful? Or is this one of those situations where you're a candidate that knows you don't have a Congress to pass X, Y, and Z? So you're going to say the kinds of things that you need to say to win without having any real expectation of following through, so you can quietly off camera, assuage the concerns of the corporate donor class that any of this is going to happen. And it deflates left energy for a candidate who can actually control foreign policy, and, let's say, hypothetically stop a genocide. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, that's what the Democrats do. They talk about a few social safety nets that Western Europe and Canada have had for decades, and they ignore corporate crime that is stealing so much of the consumer dollars, for example. They ignore the grotesque misallocation of public budgets and for empire. They don't challenge Wall Street. Wall Street is not very popular in America, even among conservatives. Wall Street over Main Street, that's a great campaign model, but they won't take it. I haven't seen what she's come out with, but they've got to make minimum wage up to $15 or more an hour authentic. People don't believe the Democrats when they talk about 15% federal minimum wage from the $7.25 they've allowed to happen for years, even when they controlled Congress. Now, that they have to make it concrete, show what it means to families to get more money for their hard work in terms of livelihoods. They're not doing that. And when they don't do that, I say they're not serious. They're just dealing with populist rhetoric that they know the Republicans will not emulate and proceed that way. And so it's all the kind of pressure that people put on her, especially in the swing states, where they're going to spend most of their time. You're not going to see Kamala Harris in Texas or Mississippi very often. You're going to see, or Massachusetts for that matter, or you're going to see them in the swing states. So people got to mobilize there, and they're going to have to meet the people. They can't do everything, by remote. It's an opportunity in the next few weeks to push forward your own agenda. Don't just say, this. You hand them the compact for the American people, for the American worker. People got to stop giving up on themselves, Briahna. People give up on themselves. And they say, I don't want to have anything more to do with politics. It's a dirty game. I say, you don't want to have anything to do with politics? But do you know anything about history? If you don't have anything to do with anything with politics is going to have a lot to do about you in a very dictatorial and cruel way. We have to learn how to talk with the voters. I never flattered the voters. I used to say to large audiences of people, if you ever see a candidate who does not flatter you in order to flummox you, in order to fool you, in order to weaken your resolve, then you've seen a visiting Martian. Yeah. And I didn't want to say, I'm not flattering you. I never flattered them. Because that's exactly what politicians do to get away from people who are challenging them and calling them out on the campaign trail.
Yeah, I mean, part of what was so interesting about that story from now probably a month or so ago, I think in the Times, about Israel's media. There's like a not a branch of, but like a media department, social media department that is, meddling in US elections. And the way it's working, it's not just, saying pro-Israel stuff. It's specifically targeting Black congressional members that are already pro-Israel, like Richie Torres. and creating a social media environment around them where they get only positive feedback for saying pro-Israel things. So it's like a booster club. And it's interesting for me to think about because I don't know necessarily that if I were designing such a thing to boost my own like agenda, that I would choose to find people who already agreed with me and make sure that they never saw any pushback. But that, Israel's not dumb. they're not bad at or historically at least they haven't been bad at or unsuccessful at, I should say, getting America to agree with their substantive agenda and to support their agenda and to enable their agenda. And there is something about that idea that that kind of flattery maybe goes farther than than I might have personally anticipated if I were to be in the position of designing such a thing. Before you go, I did want to mention this idea that Kamala Harris or other Democrats, Tim Walz, might be adopting popular rhetoric. It's going to help them win. And that to some extent, you can credit left movements for that. And that means it's working. And that's something we should be happy about and not despairing about, even if it means, less success for a third party candidate, for instance. But I would point out Prim Tucker formerly of The Intercept, now at Zateo News, reported on statistics from swing states that show that undecided voters in those states overwhelmingly would be more inclined to vote for Harris if she said she would pledge an arms embargo to Israel. So in Pennsylvania, 57% of Biden 2020 voters who are undecided say that they would be more likely to vote for Harris if she pledges an arms embargo to Israel. 0% say they'd be less likely to vote for her. So it's entirely upside. 25% of Democrats and independents in Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania say Gaza is important to them and may impact their votes. Over a third say a ceasefire and arms embargo would make them more likely to vote for the Democratic ticket. That seems to be another no-brainer. But that, so far, outside of these tonal shifts, doesn't seem to have been shifting the policy of Kamala Harris. What do you make of that?
It's a simple observation, which is even if she wanted an arms embargo, she looks to Capitol Hill and she sees overwhelming support for more money, more weapons, more support for whatever Israel does in the Middle East, and not just in Gaza. And she's going to take her cue from that. So unless more and more people are spun off on Capitol Hill to stand for American interests and to foresee and forestall the inevitable blowback, there's going to be blowback. Already, the CIA and NSA and Pentagon have developed scenarios for a blowback from what we're doing to these families and these people in the Middle East.
How do you mean?
Blowback meaning like a 9/11 situation.
Oh, I see.
They're very realistic, but they don't want to talk about it. But you can't slaughter people. 200 people in an extended family slaughtered. 180 people slaughtered. People, crushed in all kinds of ways, and not expect a blowback. And if there is a blowback, will only concentrate power more in the hands of the few against the many, and militarize our entire society even more. So she's not going to take that on. She's going to be very, very careful, and so is Tim Walz. They're not going to be as so obedient. She can focus on the horrendous blockage of humanitarian aid trucks paid for by the U.S. taxpayer that are lined up in the thousands and blocked by Israel. That's a safe thing to do. And she can talk about rebuilding the hospitals. She can talk about taking some Gazan orphans for need medical assistance. She can soften that image. But you have to remember, her husband is an avid AIPAC fan. And he often goes on TV and upstages his own spouse with his fervent support for the Israeli war machine. In more than one instance, he says it in different ways, but she's not going to fight that situation. But what we can do is increasingly spin off more and more people. There are about 100 people who boycotted Netanyahu's speech in Congress. That's a record. And there are dozens who oppose the $14 billion additional taxpayer slush fund for Netanyahu's massive genocide. So it is beginning to crack. And then you ask her, don't you think Israeli and Palestinian peace advocates, very prominent people, should have a congressional hearing? You ask questions that it's easy for her to say yes to. But, you know, you've got to have a strategy. 6 prominent Israelis wrote to Congress demanding that Congress disinvite Netanyahu. And one of the arguments they made was that Netanyahu was destroying the state of Israel. Those were their very words. One of them was a former prime minister. They're very prominent Israelis. And again, you see, the press didn't publicize it, but there are a lot of prominent people in Israel. I mean, Netanyahu is despised by 3 out of 4 people. He's under indictment by Israeli prosecutors for corruption. He's been marched against by millions of Israelis for trying to strip away the independence of their court system. And the crazies that he's allied himself with to become the big crazy are very unpopular, but they got the slight margin in a parliamentary majority, and they've hijacked whatever contrary forces there might have been. And also, they hate him for dropping the defense system on the border. That's another thing. That he has stopped any investigation on why he, having Hamas's plans a year ago, before October 7th, he had them in their hands and he ignored them. Why this multi-tiered, world-class technological border security system suddenly collapsed on October 7th. And as the 6 prominent Israelis said in their letter, allowed Hamas to come in. They couldn't have got 10 feet into Israel with the existing border security system, which is the most strict in the world. And he has blocked any kind of investigation. She should be asked about that. Shouldn't there be an investigation? She should say, don't you think Prime Minister Netanyahu should allow U.S. war correspondents into Gaza? He's excluded reporters from Israel and all other countries for years from going into Gaza to see what's really going on under the heel of the Israeli military and embargo. So she should be asked, don't you think American reporters should be allowed? Every major news organization in this country, including the Post and Times, in a full-page ad recently, demanded that Gaza be open to journalists. So she can be asked these questions that are easy to say yes and start unraveling this Israel can do whatever it wants, no matter what U.S. law provides for.
I'm afraid I can very easily imagine a world, 2 scenarios. One, she agrees when she's in front of reporters. First of all, we're waiting for the day she's in front of reporters. Okay. Putting that her ability to avoid these questions to the side for a minute. If she were to finally confront the press and there happened to be principled journalists in the room who could lob one of those kinds of questions, I could see her sort of saying yes in the room and then doing what she's done so many times in the past, which is to walk off stage after saying she supports Medicare for all and the end to private insurance. And then her people issue a statement saying, no, actually, she didn't mean it. Or the statement that she just issued after saying some sympathetic things about Palestine, assuring the public that she doesn't actually support an arms embargo, right? And, you know, another scenario I imagine is that she or one of her surrogates does what Biden's surrogates have been doing incredibly for 10 months as the questions get better and sharper and the reporters get more appalled and push harder because of what they've been seeing covering for the last 10 months. They're able to parry these questions away. They simply say, maybe we'll put in a clip here of one of the more egregious ones I saw today.
Separate point, but this is a government-announced settlement. This isn't an outpost. So, I mean, it's the same question, really. If you oppose it, I don't quite see why you can't stop it.
I'm sorry, I don't really follow, Tom.
I mean, you've opposed hundreds of settlement announcements, and they are all then built. So what's the point of repeatedly saying you oppose them?
It is important for us to make clear our perspective and our point of view, as well as to raise these sometimes tough and difficult conversations with our Israeli partners, and we'll continue to do so.
But doesn't it just expose the weakness of your position in that you can say something and say it's your policy, but clearly it doesn't have any effects on the ground?
I would take issue with that characterization, Tom. These are not actions that the United States is party to, certainly not ones that we are involved in. Ultimately, Israel is a sovereign country that's going to make its own decisions. That does not detract or change from the fact that when we see things, when we see policy decisions, when we see actions that we disagree with, that we think are not just in the interest of the United States, but also not in the interest of the region, we won't hesitate to say so. It is not dissimilar from circumstances in other countries in which the United States is not party to those decisions, but when we see something we disagree with, we certainly will make our voices heard, and that continues to be the case here. I will also say that the bigger issue here, Tom, is that we want to see these kinds of things end, and that is why we're so committed to getting to a two-state solution, because we think that is the only path forward for the region. And when we see things like this that are inconsistent with that, we won't hesitate to say so.
Well, you want to see a two-state solution, but I mean, Smotrich himself said in announcing the settlement, we'll continue to fight the dangerous idea of a Palestinian state and establish facts on the ground. This is my life's mission, and I will continue it as much as I can. So that's what you're up against when you're saying you oppose the building of these settlements. Clearly, this will go ahead, and it will not just go ahead, but it will go ahead in occupied territory where you are arming the military force which will facilitate its establishment. So you're saying you oppose it, but you're arming the military force that facilitates its establishment.
We have a security relationship with the IDF, Tom. I don't dispute that. That of course continues to be the case.
How is building a settlement about self-defense of Green Line sovereign Israel?
We don't think it is.
When asked directly about torture camps and gang rapes that we see on video of Palestinian prisoners, and twin children who were 4 days old and their mother and grandmother being targeted and murdered while their father went out to get their birth certificates, or a toddler who I have to see severed down the middle in two pieces, top and bottom, on my timeline, because that's just what it is in Gaza right now, or people being doled out bags of body parts because the last bombing a few days ago left 0 people intact. Right. And when asked about that, the spokesperson Patel simply says over and over again, we've asked Israel to look into that. We've asked Israel to investigate. Of course, we take this very seriously, and we don't approve of X, Y, and Z. And the reporter's like, well, OK, you've been saying that forever. What are you going to do? What accountability mechanism is there? Well, you'd have to ask Israel about that. So, I mean,
that's why my questions, Briahna, are designed, in addition to the good ones that you just posited, to alienate groups in the U.S., which she's very worried about. So when you say, why don't you let U.S. reporters in to see what U.S. taxpayer dollars are being used for, instead of being used back home for all the necessities and communities in America, you're basically saying to her, you better give the right answer, because you're going to alienate people that don't necessarily care what's going on over there, but care what's being done to us here. So the only thing is just to keep the heat on and not prejudge. A lot of progressives engage in prejudgment, and that stops them from further action. Don't prejudge. It'll break open. They can only stay mum for so long on obvious questions that 90% of the people want answers to and support. I mean, if you ask people, do you think U.S. reporters should be allowed in Gaza? That would come in at 95%. You ask people, do you think tax dollars unconditionally sent to Israel to slaughter Palestinians in violation of 6 federal statutes that prevent it, including the Leahy Amendment, you get huge support. You bring it back here, and you provoke different constituents that she has to pay attention to, not just Arab Americans from Dearborn, Michigan.
And then, Ralph, you ask them, even if you disagree with Kamala's answers on that, are you willing to not vote for her and allow Trump to win? That's the framing. That's what gets people to say, yeah, I really hate all those things about Kamala. I hate all those things about Biden, but I'm going to vote for them anyway. And I will say the reporters have been doing a really tremendous job. But even if they get the embarrassing answer out of Max Miller or Kirby or Patel, that's not like there's a mainstream media outlet that takes that clip that's so embarrassing for the administration, shows it to the public and say, look what they're willing to say that they will allow out of the Israeli government. Look at this, empty, feckless reply. Like, look at what they're doing with your tax dollars to these babies overseas. Like, it just stops. It starts and stops there at the press conference. You have a couple of people in the media, who are, Ali Velshi, Mehdi Hassan. I saw Joyanne Reid seems to be genuinely upset about this and doing better than most on her show on MSNBC. But it's so infrequent and so rare. And I don't mean to be sounding like so dispirited. I'm sorry, I really am. But that to me, my demoralization is not because people aren't asking the right questions or people aren't protesting the right way or people aren't doing. It's that I'm seeing so much that's being done right that is at the end of the day completely demoralized, completely have all the energy sucked out of it because now it's Kamala Harris and not Joe Biden. And Donald Trump is very bad. And we got to stop Trump. It's the stop Trump of it all that from day one, since I started this podcast and that debate with Noam Chomsky, that seems to be the impossible hurdle to overcome. And even you, I want to ask you this, Ralph. I hear you saying that people should vote their conscience. And I am curious why. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but no one seems to really be willing to say, no, I actually think you should not vote for Democrats. I think you should vote for an independent third party. I think you should vote for the Greens.
Well, look, I've just written a book called Let's Start the Revolution. It's very practical and very relevant to today's election year issues. And one of the things I try to do is to get voters to become smarter. When they're asked who they're going to vote for, they'll say that depends on what the candidates stand for and have fought for, and I'm not going to decide until Election Day. Why do they telegraph their vote in April and May? Then they lose all bargaining power with these candidates. So there's a lot of ways to push candidates into more progressive pathways, and that's why I wrote this book. And of course, it's not being reviewed by the New York Times or Post. But it's very readable, and it lifts people's morale. I mean, people can do themselves in by themselves, all by themselves, just by becoming demoralized and looking at the terrible scene. But things happen that are unpredictable until they happen. That's what Black Swan are all about. They happen, and all of a sudden, the breakthrough occurs. It could be at the State Department with the spokesman being asked a question by Sami Husseini, or it could be a malicious slur that arouses people who are outraged at this type of thing. Or it could be new people coming in. There are people now, families whose children were harmed or lost their lives to social media provocations facilitated by the wardens of Silicon Valley and the internet gulag. And they're up on Capitol Hill. There's only a handful of them, but the senators couldn't stare them down. They just passed an online child safety law with only 3 senators opposing, over 90. And it was all attributed to going in and out of the offices by these mothers and fathers who lost their children. And all the lobbying by Silicon Valley couldn't block it. So people have to realize the the deep power inside them once they connect with one another, and because they have a moral authority and they have the votes. Corporations don't have the votes, not yet at least. It's the people who have the votes. And there's no mention of the corporation or company or political parties in our Constitution. Isn't that interesting? When you were at Harvard Law School, Briahna, did they point that out? How come they control us? There's no mention of corporations, companies, or political parties. Only persons.
Do you feel like there's kind of risk of backlash and kind of losing kind of public legitimacy if you or other kind of third-party advocates, people like myself, were to explicitly say, I don't think you should vote for the Democratic Party, as opposed to, people like Eddie Glaude who have said in the past, if you're in a red state or a blue state, you should vote your conscience, or generally speaking, you should vote your conscience. I mean, do you see what I'm saying? That there seems to be a line that even very, courageous people and people who have been actual candidates like yourself seem not to win across. Is it because you think you lose legitimacy? Do you think it seems too pushy and you don't want to tell voters what to do in any direction? Or is it a sort of, yeah.
It's the Bernie problem. Bernie supported Biden because of his fear of Trump, the Trumpsters, and American fascism. And that is what blocks people from urging people to vote their conscience, to vote their own legitimate interests, by voting only for candidates who have persuaded them that they will stand for them when the pressure increases should they get elected. So that's why I always say, the moment you vote for the least worst, that means you're trapped by the least worst. You got to shut up. And that means every 4 years, they'll give you the least worst trap, and you never get out of it. And if you never get out of it, how do you displace the two-party oligopoly? How do you have other parties gaining more adherents and votes and agendas? How do you have change? You can't have change. They always say, I have liberal Democrats say, not this time, Ralph. But I say, you said that in 2004, in 2008, in 2012, in 2016. When is it ever time? So the way to do it is you take away votes. I mean, if you're worried about Trump, you take away 10% of his votes. Who, they're 10, 15% of the people really don't like Trump, but they're never talked to. They're talked down to. They're degraded. They're called foolish, ignorant. And any party can lose 10, 15% of its edge if people would only focus on it and not turn away from it. I mean, we co-authored a book called Wrecking America on Donald Trump in 2020, and I devoted a whole section to speaking to Trump voters, to asking them why, when, where, what's on your mind, what turns you off, how much homework have you done, what kind of life do you want for your family and your children and the country and the world? So we have to do that.
I guess I'm thinking more about Democratic voters, and I'm thinking about the willingness. What it feels to me is you have to have a willingness to, Trump will win if you don't listen to me. That is what the leverage is in essence for the left of center voter. Yes, you have to have any leverage whatsoever politically, you have to be willing to let Trump win. Or to your point, Romney or Bush or whomever, because they're always framed in those kind of terms as like the worst person that's ever happened. And maybe it's true because they do keep getting worse because everyone keeps sliding to the right together. And I don't know, it feels like you're just not allowed to say that.
Excuse me. It isn't just a matter of the vote. It's what you do before the vote, before Election Day. For example, let's say you don't want Trump to win, but you don't want to vote for the Democrats. But if you vote for the Greens, you're under the impression that you're voting to support Trump because you're taking a vote from the Democrat. There are all kinds of people in your neighborhood who don't even vote. There are all kinds of people in your neighborhood who don't even vote. Get them to vote. Get it. There are all kinds of dialogues. You get active. The point is, you never want to vote for a party that is against you. I mean, that's called masochism. You don't want to vote for a party that reduces the taxes to the super rich, or doesn't do anything about social safety nets, just rhetoric, family paid leave, daycare, maternal leave, everything that Western Europe and Canada, as I said, have. You don't want to do that. You have to have a sense of dignity here, a sense of what you stand for. Otherwise, you're part of the machine. They've got you up against the wall saying, choose between tuberculosis and cancer.
Yeah, but a lot of people will hear that. Like what we have to confront it, we have to be honest about is people hear that and say, well, obviously I'll choose tuberculosis. Like obviously tuberculosis is better than cancer. And these are my choices. And it's naive of you to think that I should just not fight against cancer because tuberculosis is also bad. And the project seems to me to be understanding that that's a false choice and that you could either force tuberculosis to not be tuberculosis, right? They're choosing to be tuberculosis. They could be, healthy, but they're choosing to be tuberculosis because of, moneyed interest or whatever. And that they would frankly be more electable if they made themselves a healthy option instead of marketing themselves as a lesser illness.
Well, there's a more generic solution. It's called rank voting. Instant runoff voting will take care of the winner-take-all type of up against the wall, either or problem. And the Democrats Party have been told this by a lot of loyal progressive Democrats. It does exist in San Francisco, exists in some parts of Maine, where you basically vote for your first choice, second choice, third choice. And if the first choice doesn't get majority, the second choice votes kick in. And if they don't get a majority winner, the third votes stick in. That gets rid of the spoiler issue.
But which is why the Democratic Party will never accept it. Right. But that is why neither major party will ever support it, because they are dependent on the threat of the alternative to get people.
Then you say you're not extorting me anymore as a voter. I'm voting my conscience.
Yeah. Well, look, I so appreciate you standing up against that extortion now and for so many years and being such a clarifying voice in all of this. As we wrap, can you tell the audience again where they can find the Capitol Hill Citizen?
Yes, it's in print only. You can go to capitolcitizen.com, and for a donation of $5 or more, you'll get this 40-page newspaper, very well designed, sent to you immediately, first class. And if you want more, the instructions are on the website, capitolcitizen.com. Just how you can get more for your own circle of friends, civic activists, workplace, etc. The response by those who've read it has been beyond tremendous, Briahna. And the letters to the editor illustrate that people are sick and tired of the clutter on the internet and the intrusions, the advertisements, and they say how nice it is to hold a newspaper that's dark print in my hands without any distractions. But the most important thing is it shows you by the force of information and strategies how you can become a Capitol citizen. In other words, you become a watchdog of your senators and representatives. It doesn't take more than 1% on many issues that the American people are together on and not subject to the divide and rule manipulation of the ruling groups that's been underway for over 2,000 years.
Yeah. Well, Ralph Nader, it is always such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Thank you. Thank you to all the listeners for tuning in today. And as you're well aware at this point, I'm sure, if you want an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast every week, you can go and subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for exactly that. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves. And remember, to keep the faith.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.